welcome. My name is Rachel Branke. This is Coffee and Contracts. I am the head attorney and photographer at TheLawTog, the go-to legal resource for photographers. Today, we're going to chat just a little bit about contract amendments. And I know that this is probably one of the most boring topics. Other stuff that we talk about is like copyright infringement or client issues. A lot of that is a lot more fun. But I tell you what, contract amendments is a really big topic of conversation that we have in the TheLawTog Facebook group, and we have a document in the TheLawTog shop for you guys to use. We actually have 3 of them for 3 different purposes. I'm going to go over here in a bit, but I think it's incredibly important if things change. You know, if you're looking to reschedule, cancel, or change terms such as payment or services, those are the 3. It is really important to put it in writing, right? I always talk about that contractual agreements don't have to be in writing to be legally enforceable. Some states allow for verbal. You can even have written like email communication or social media communication, but it's easier when you have everything in one place, 4 corners of a document, because it legally protects, it sets expectations. Tell you what, one time I was in court defending a client, and their client was pursuing them for alleged breach of contract. And of course, so what had to come up was the contract. Well, unfortunately, we had one contract over here, we had an amendment over there, we had email over here, we had social media over here, we had text over here. And so it was a hot mess trying to not only like talk to the judge and say, first we were here, then we went here, then my client went there, went here. Like, it's just easier to have it all in one place. And it's just a lot more like confidence building for you guys. It reduces any angst, anxiety for you, for the client, and any potential miscommunication. So really always try to at least have like your main services contract, like we talked about on the last episode. It's going to create the legal relationship between you and the client. It's going to say what they're going to pay you, what you're going to give them in response, like services or products, and how, you know, how to get booked, how the session's going to go, cancels, reschedules, all those things, right? You can look at the bullet point list at TheLawTog.com for any of the services contracts that are in the essentials bundles, because they're essential. But what is incredibly important is that there are changes, right? We always hear like the dreaded client going, oh my gosh, I want to reduce my package. But it could also be a positive. What if the client wants to increase the package? They want to add on multiple sessions, right? I have a client that is actually a DJ, so in the creative wedding industry field. And with this last week, ended up, you know, had booked the client and had a contract, which was great. But then all of a sudden, the client is wanting to add on multiple locations, right? So not only are they having to take like all your equipment to one location and do services, but then you're looking at coverage and moving and trying to put together a timeline and go to different locations, but most importantly, wanted to be compensated for those changes. And that's kind of what prompted a bit of this conversation today, is just making sure that we have it all in one place, because you don't want to just go, okay, client, I'll add on a couple of extra wedding hours for you, or sure, I'll give you 10 extra digitals, you know, verbally. And then later when you invoice them, the client's going, oh my gosh, I'm not going to pay this. And then you don't really have anything to point to, right? So we want to put it in writing. Now, before we even get into like how it works, what it looks like, we have to consider, and I talk about this all the time on Coffee and Contracts, because I think what's incredibly important in running a business is getting to be the business owner, right? We've got all this legal stuff that we have to do. There's also the good to have legal stuff, but before we can get to any of those, we really have to chit chat with ourselves and see like, what do we want to do business-wise? So like when we talked about a last episode with client issues, if you have a client issue that comes to you, start with what the legal obligation you have is, then look at what you want to do business and customer focused, right? And then you can make your decision. It's kind of the inverse here for contract amendment. When you get an inquiry from your client asking for a change, whether it's to add on or to deduct from like products or services, think about, okay, what do I want to do first, right? That's where you need to start. And what's funny is we actually had an inquiry today through the TheLawTog on the website. We have a fun little chat bubble. I'm really excited. It's like the little things, right, that make me really excited. And we got this new integration within the last few months, and it's wonderful because you don't have to worry about submitting through the contact form, wait for an email. You can almost live chat with us. Like, we try to have someone manning it as much as we can. If we're not there, we'll end up sending you an email. But anyways, this morning, someone had inquired about something specific to like a model release. And and said, what do I do in this situation? Like, what is the legal requirement? And I was like, hold up, time out. We got to start with what you want to offer first, right? So always think about, what is the client asking for? And is it something you're willing to do? Like, for example, if you have a wedding client that has booked you for 8 hours, right? You have that services contract because you got it from TheLawTog.com and you've downloaded it, you executed it, and all of it's good to go. But then your client comes back about a month out of the wedding and goes, oh, I want to reduce it to 4 hours. Well, guess what? You don't necessarily have to do it. So we want to start with, what do we want to do, right? Out of what the client is requesting, and making sure we've asked the questions to make sure that we know exactly what they're asking. But what is it we want to do as a business, right? And then we can go into, what do we need to do on the legal side, which is going to be a contract amendment if you're going to allow it, right? But in that case, they, being the client, is already legally obligated to you for 8 hours. So the first question, like I said, is about, what do you want to do? Do you want to have the client stick to the 8 hours, or do you want to allow them to reduce? All right. So again, it's kind of flipped on its head. Normally for client issues, we look at what the legal obligation is, then decide what we want to do for our business. Instead, when it comes to contract amendments, when we get that inquiry from the client, or maybe they're not even a client yet, right? They're a potential client. We can say to we can say to them, oh, and by the way, just so we're clear on it, contract amendment, this is after we've already had a services contract executed. So this isn't like your regular services contract being sent out and then amending that, right? You already have a fully executed services contract. Okay, so we're gonna look at, what do we want to do, then what do we need to legally adjust, right? So what we're gonna use for that is, oh no, wait, before we get into that, now, this is where we look to the executed services contract and say, what does it say about changes, right? And I can't speak to, obviously, every contract that's out there. I've mentioned it before, and I love saying this. I feel like just so you guys get a little insight of what contract drafting is like. In law school, they don't tell us, oh, you have to have headings, you have to have numbers, or you have to use this. Like, it's an art form. We, as lawyers, get to draft it in such a way, as long as it meets the elements of a contract, like offer, acceptance, consideration, capacity, meeting of the minds, all those things, right? As long as it meets kind of all these non-physically seen elements, then we get to draft it in the way that we like to draft it. And what I love to do it, again, as an art form, is to put it in parallel to what your workflow is, because that works with the client psychology. It just is more comfortable. They know what the next steps are going to be. It sets you up for being able to provide customer service. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about with this, spent about 40 minutes last episode. Go check that one out, because we really dig into how it works and how you should have it like that, etc. But what I'm trying to get at is, here we want to look into our contract first, once we have this amendment request, once we've decided, okay, we want to allow it, if we do, and see, what does our contract say about allowing for any sort of changes to the contract, right? It might say in there very specifically, just give written request. It might be silent at all. It's okay if it doesn't say anything, right? Because the idea is, in your initial services contract, that's it. There are going to be no changes. You're agreeing to all these terms. You are the photographer bound. The client is bound. This is the game. This is where we're going to play ball, right? So just because it's silent on any changes doesn't mean that it's wrong. In fact, I don't know necessarily if I would want to open the door with a whole bunch of information about changes, because the idea is we don't want to necessarily allow changes. But if you do, this is where having a contract amendment, a physical written form, another contract essentially that goes with it, comes into play. And I mentioned earlier, there's 3 main times that this is going to happen, right? Reschedules. So if you need to reschedule an event, we saw this a lot with COVID and weddings. Cancellations, right? Maybe something went awry in the conversation and you want to cancel out any further obligations. You want to have that in writing, so there's not like this open-ended, right? We want to tie up the end of that string. We don't want to leave it open-ended of that client potentially coming around and wanting to enforce any of those rights or obligations under the contract. And then last is terms, like the example I've given about the DJ is payment or services being changed. Again, that can go up, that can go down, whatever the client's request is going to be and whatever you decide that you want it to do. So those are the 3 main type of amendments that we're looking at having. Now, I think was incredibly important, I kind of already gave a little bit of preview of this, is why of having an amendment document is important. Having this is, one, is that it puts everything in writing, sets expectations. It makes it easier If there's ever an issue, we have to go to court, but don't necessarily do that. I can figure it out if I need to later on, but it makes it easier when you're talking and communicating with a client, right? We want to make sure that we're very clear, because we've talked about communication on past episodes. Just because we know what a term means doesn't mean a client knows what that means, and vice versa. A client may have a term, like we hear all the time, clients say, I want the copyrights. Often they just want print rights, right? So we don't want to assume anything. So we put it in writing to make sure that we're all literally on the same page, right, in this amendment document. It also identifies what number of changes that this is, because you can have multiple amendments that attach to a contract and make multiple changes over time. And we saw this incredibly a lot with pandemic. Why? Because dates kept getting changed, services and locations kept getting changed, so prices ended up changing. All of these things were happening, right? We want to make sure that we have a sequential paper trail. And so we have our services contract, and that's where the whole party starts, right? Then you may have a next amendment where maybe it changes a date. Then you might have another one where they decide to add on another shooter, like a second shooter, another second shooter, or a couple of hours. We want to identify which amendment, amendment page that we have, what change that is, because they build upon themselves based on the language in the document. This is why there are a few key things that we put into these amendments and these addendums that we attach to contracts that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Just like with services contracts, there's legal miscellany that you wouldn't necessarily think to put in there if you drafted it yourself. That's why we go lawyer drafted. But this is why it's incredibly important, to have it all in one place, have it in writing, clear out any potential miscommunications, but also to make sure we have a sequential number of changes, because things may change back and forth as like on weddings specifically. Wedding planning can be variable. Maybe worldwide pandemic can cause for variables, right? So we want to make sure it's in order. And then we also want to ensure that there's consideration, right? I kind of threw that word in earlier and didn't really define it. It's one of the elements of a contract. So anytime you have changes, you have to have considerations in exchange. And that's what we want to make sure that we also outline into the contract. And the most typical consideration, which is in exchange for something, is that you're going to get paid and you're going to provide a product or service to the client, right? And so that's what we're going to look at for here, whether it's reschedule, cancellation, or a change of terms like payment or services. There's also a couple other legal miscellany that we want to put in there, just making sure that the original services contract is all in place. It's not doing any waiving or rewriting of any other essential terms, to make sure that you are protected. But all you need to know with that is get a lawyer drafted contract amendment, utilize it when you need to, and make sure that you keep all of your papers in order, so we have that sequential paper trail to make sure we're on the up and up, and really less so, of course, always legal protection, but more so that you guys are on top with your clients and making sure you're being able to provide the services and do the things that you need to do for them. Okay, so that is everything on contract amendments. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask.